They were the epitome of respectability, a group of highly trained doctors and surgeons enjoying a spring break in a secure European resort. It was the perfect picture of a middle-class holiday, until the silence of apartment 5A was broken, not by the sound of a forced entry, but by a frantic declaration that would ignite the most expensive and controversial missing person inquiry in history. But what if the global story of a phantom predator was merely a shadow cast to hide a much closer, more uncomfortable reality? From forensic blood dogs alerting behind a living room sofa to a timeline of witness statements that shifted under police scrutiny, the archived files tell a story that stands in stark contrast to the one played out in the media. We are about to walk through the evidence that money and political power tried to bury. Before we unlock these files, please take a moment to press the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support is the only way we can keep asking the difficult questions that the establishment once ignored. Now, to understand the truth, we must look past the headlines and return to the very beginning, to the warm, sunny coast of the Algarve, where the nightmare began. The narrative of what would become the most high-profile missing person investigation in modern history began not with a crime, but with a holiday. To understand the gravity of the events that unfolded in Portugal, one must first examine the setting, the players, and the unique social dynamics that defined the days leading up to the 3rd of May, 2007. This was a gathering of 9 adults, a group of highly educated professionals from the United Kingdom who arrived in the Algarve region, expecting a period of relaxation and leisure. Instead, their presence in the resort village of Praia da Luz would soon trigger a global media phenomenon and a complex legal and diplomatic entanglement that persists to this day. The focal point of this group was the McCann family. The father, a consultant cardiologist, and the mother, a general practitioner, were emblematic of the British middle-class successful, respectable, and well-connected within the medical establishment. They were accompanied by a cohort of friends, most of whom also worked in the medical field. This demographic detail is crucial for 2 reasons. Firstly, it established a perception of supreme trustworthiness and responsibility. Society inherently trusts doctors to preserve life and make sound judgments. Secondly, investigative journalists and cultural commentators have since argued that this social standing played a significant role in the unprecedented media response that followed. Had this group been of a different socioeconomic background, it is a matter of debate whether the British government and international press would have mobilized with such immediate and overwhelming force. The location chosen for this retreat was the Ocean Club in Praia da Luz. To the casual observer, it appeared to be a secure, family-oriented environment. However, a forensic reconstruction of the geography reveals significant details that challenge the initial narrative provided by the subjects. The group was staying in apartments located on the ground floor, specifically apartment 5A, which sat at the corner of the block. For their evening meals, the 9 adults chose to dine at the Tapas Bar, a restaurant situated within the complex but physically separated from the sleeping quarters. A critical point of contention that arose in the aftermath concerns the physical distance between the dining table and the apartment where the sleeping family members lay. In early statements and media appearances, the father described the arrangement as being comparable to dining in one's own garden, implying a proximity that allowed for easy visual or auditory monitoring. However, independent investigators who have walked the site have challenged this comparison. To travel from the Tapas Bar to apartment 5A requires a walk that can take up to 6 minutes if navigating the public route, or perhaps 2 to 3 minutes at a brisk pace. But it is certainly not a direct line of sight. The distance is significant enough that visual observation of the apartment entrance from the dining area was virtually impossible due to obstructions, including a wall and vegetation. This geographical reality introduces the first major analytical question of the case: the decision-making process regarding the supervision of the younger members of the group. The adults established a checking system, where members of the party would take turns leaving the dinner table to inspect the apartments. While this was presented as a responsible mitigation of risk, retrospective analysis suggests it may have created a false sense of security. The narrative relies on the assumption that a check every 20 minutes is sufficient to ensure safety. Yet, in the intervening moments, the apartment remained unlocked and accessible to the public road. It is a detail that many observers find difficult to reconcile with the professional background of the group. The atmosphere in Praia da Luz during that week was relaxed. The group engaged in tennis lessons, pool time, and social dinners. There was no indication of an external threat, nor were there reports of suspicious activity directly targeting the group in the days prior. This tranquility, however, may have contributed to a lowering of guard. The collective mindset of the Group 9 intelligent adults likely reinforced a psychological phenomenon known as diffusion of responsibility, or simply the safety felt in large numbers. They believed they were in a secure bubble, insulated from the dangers of the outside world. Among the sleeping dependents in apartment 5A was the eldest daughter, the individual who would soon become known to the entire world simply by her first name. She was a distinct individual, easily identifiable by a rare ocular condition known as a coloboma bleed of the iris in her right eye. This unique physical trait would later become a key element in the global search campaign, a detail stamped onto millions of posters. At the time of the holiday, however, she was simply the firstborn offspring of a medical couple, asleep in a room with her younger siblings, a set of twins. It is important to note the immediate reaction of the media when the alarm was eventually raised. Within hours of the reported disappearance, major British broadsheets, like the Daily Telegraph, were running the story. This speed of reporting is highly unusual for a missing person case in a foreign jurisdiction. Statistical data indicates that a person goes missing roughly every 5 minutes in the United Kingdom, yet very few cases receive national, let alone international, coverage. This anomaly has led to persistent speculation about the influence of the establishment. Was the rapid mobilization of resources a result of the father's government-adjacent work or the group's social status? The swift involvement of high-ranking political figures, including the then Prime Minister and his successor, suggests that this was treated from the outset as a matter of state importance, rather than a standard police investigation. As the sun set on the 3rd of May, the group prepared for another evening at the tapas bar. The routine was established. The younger family members were placed in their beds, the doors were closed, and the adults convened for dinner and wine. To the waiters and other staff at the Ocean Club, it was an unremarkable scene. There was no foreshadowing of the chaos that was to come. The investigation files later revealed that the checking system was in operation that night. One of the fathers from the group checked the apartment at approximately 9 o'clock. Another member checked at roughly 9:30. It was not until the mother left the table at 10 o'clock to conduct her check that the reality of the situation shattered the calm of the Algarve night. The events of that evening are frozen in time, dissected by thousands of internet sleuths, police officers, and journalists. Yet, the foundational questions remain rooted in these initial circumstances. Why did a group of medical professionals feel comfortable leaving their sleeping offspring in an apartment that was accessible from a public street, separated by a significant walking distance? Why was the immediate assumption one of abduction, rather than the more common occurrence of a wandering individual? And why, in the years that followed, would the narrative of that night be so fiercely protected by legal threats and high-level political intervention? The stage was set in apartment 5A. The actors were in place at the tapas bar. The timeline was ticking toward 10 o'clock, but as the story moved from a holiday diary to a police procedural, discrepancies began to emerge, small cracks in the timeline and variations in witness accounts that would fuel decades of skepticism. The Portuguese authorities would soon find themselves clashing with British sensibilities, and the world would be asked to believe a singular, terrifying version of events, while other, more forensic-based theories were quietly pushed into the shadows. The enigma of Praia da Luz had begun. To comprehend the anomaly of the disappearance, one must first dissect the established routine of the group. By the evening of May the 3rd, 2007, The holiday patterns of the 9 adults and their accompanying family members had been firmly set. Investigative journalists and criminologists have long scrutinized this specific behavior, known in the case files as the checking system. It is this mechanism of supervision, or the lack thereof, that forms the central pillar of the initial inquiry and remains one of the most fiercely debated aspects of the entire timeline. The strategy employed by the group was designed to allow the adults to dine collectively at the tapas bar while the younger family members slept in their respective apartments. The premise was simple. The adults would rotate, leaving the dinner table at intervals to monitor the sleeping quarters. According to public statements and media reports, the intention was to conduct these checks every 15 to 20 minutes. On the surface, this system appeared to be a responsible compromise between parental duty and social relaxation. However, a forensic analysis of the physical environment suggests that this arrangement possessed significant security vulnerabilities that were either overlooked or underestimated by the group. The primary point of contention lies in the physical relationship between the dining venue and the accommodation. The father of the missing subject famously defended their decision by comparing the distance to dining in one's own backyard garden. This comparison implies a proximity that suggests immediate access and auditory connection. However, independent investigations and on-site reconstructions paint a starkly different picture. The distance between the tapas bar and apartment 5A is not merely a step across a patio. It is a significant physical separation that involves navigating public pathways. Observers who have physically walked the route report that the journey is substantial. At a standard walking pace, it is estimated to take a good 6 minutes to navigate the perimeter and reach the apartment entrance, although a hurried pace could reduce this to perhaps 2 or 3 minutes. Crucially, the layout of the resort meant that the dining table did not offer a direct line of sight to the apartment doors. There were visual obstructions, including walls and vegetation, which rendered static observation impossible. Therefore, for the vast majority of the evening, the time between the 20-minute checks, the sleeping family members were effectively unsupervised and out of view. This geographical reality raises a critical question regarding the risk assessment made by the parents. In a standard domestic setting, dining in the garden implies that a cry of distress or the sound of a disturbance would be audible. In the context of the Ocean Club, the distance and the ambient noise of an open-air restaurant meant that auditory monitoring was unfeasible. The checking system, therefore, was not a continuous shield of protection, but rather a series of brief, intermittent snapshots of safety. For the duration of the intervals between checks, the apartment was vulnerable. On the night in question, the timeline of movements began to unfold with what appeared to be clockwork precision, though retrospective analysis reveals discrepancies that have troubled investigators. The group arrived at the tapas bar at approximately 8:30 in the evening. The sleeping arrangements in apartment 5A placed the eldest daughter and the 2 younger siblings in the bedroom, located at the front of the unit, overlooking the complex's car park and street. The first significant movement in the timeline occurred around 9 o'clock, or shortly thereafter. The father left the dining table to conduct his check. According to the accepted narrative, he entered the apartment and observed that the family members were accounted for and asleep. It was upon his exit that a crucial interaction took place. The father was reported to have engaged in a conversation with a television producer who was also holidaying at the resort. This conversation, taking place on the street outside the apartment, establishes a verified location for the father at that specific time. This interaction is pivotal for 2 reasons. Firstly, it provides an alibi for the father's location at roughly 9:15. Secondly, it establishes the status of the apartment at that moment. If the father's account is accurate, the environment was secure and the family members were safe. However, the Portuguese authorities would later question the minute details of this time frame. Specifically, investigators noted that the father's description of how he entered the apartment, whether through the front door or the unlocked rear patio door, seemed to shift in statements given between May the 4th and May the 10th. Such inconsistencies while potentially attributable to the trauma of the event, invariably attract the attention of forensic analysts looking for cracks in a rehearsed narrative. Following the father's return to the restaurant, the duty of checking passed to another member of the group. At approximately 9:30, a friend of the family left the table to check on his own apartment and offered to listen at the door of the McCann apartment as well. This check was less intrusive. Reports suggest he merely listened for sounds of distress rather than visually confirming the presence of the sleeping subject. Silence was interpreted as safety. This assumption that silence equated to security would later be criticized as a fundamental flaw in the group's methodology. A silent room could indicate deep sleep, but it could equally indicate an empty room. The analytical perspective on this evening reveals a disturbing paradox. The group consisted largely of medical professionals, individuals trained to adhere to strict protocols and prioritize safety. Yet, the checking system they devised relied heavily on the assumption that the environment was benign. They operated under the belief that the resort was a sanctuary, insulated from the predatory risks of the wider world. The comparison to a backyard garden suggests a psychological state where the public space of the resort was mentally mapped as a private, safe extension of their domestic sphere. Critically, this routine required the apartment to remain accessible, to facilitate these checks without carrying keys back and forth or risking the noise of unlocking doors. The patio doors were left unlocked. This decision effectively removed the physical barrier between the sleeping family members and the public. While the parents viewed this as a logistical convenience for their checking routine, a security expert would view it as a critical breach of perimeter safety. The reliance on the 20-minute window meant that any potential intruder, indeed, any wandering individual, had ample opportunity to enter or exit the premises undetected during the unguarded intervals. As the clock ticked toward 10 in the evening, the routine continued. The wine flowed at the tapas bar, and the laughter of the group masked the silent, static timeline unfolding in apartment 5A. The checking system, flawed in its conception and casual in its execution, was about to face its ultimate failure. The assumption of safety was an illusion, sustained only by the fact that, until that moment, nothing had gone wrong. But as the mother prepared to leave the table for her turn in the rotation, the fragile logic of their evening was on the verge of total collapse. The distance she had to walk that immense 6-minute journey was about to become the longest walk of her life. The turning point of the entire investigation can be pinpointed to a singular moment in the timeline: 10 o'clock in the evening. This was the hour when the mother of the missing subject excused herself from the dining table at the tapas bar to conduct her rotation in the checking system. Until this juncture, the evening had proceeded without recorded incident, but the events that followed within minutes of her departure would generate inconsistencies that forensic analysts and behavioral psychologists continue to debate years later. According to the established timeline, the mother entered apartment 5A with the intention of verifying the safety of the sleeping family members. What she encountered, the absence of what she expected to find, triggered a chain reaction that permanently altered the trajectory of the case. Upon discovering that the eldest daughter was not in the bed, the immediate response of the mother has become a focal point for critical analysis. Standard behavioral models suggest that a parent's first instinct upon finding a family member missing from their bed is to search the immediate premises, checking bathrooms, wardrobes, or adjacent rooms, assuming the individual has simply wandered off. However, the actions taken by the mother deviated significantly from this expected norm. Instead of conducting a thorough sweep of the apartment or securing the safety of the 2 remaining siblings who were still asleep in the same room, the mother reportedly ran back to the tapas bar to alert the group. This decision is viewed by many investigative observers as highly anomalous. If the prevailing belief was that a predatory intruder had breached the apartment, the logical biological imperative would be to remain with the vulnerable siblings left behind to ensure their protection. By leaving the apartment to seek assistance, the remaining dependents were left unguarded in a crime scene that was potentially still active. The specific language used by the mother upon her return to the dining group is equally significant. Witnesses state that she did not cry out that her daughter was missing or lost. Rather, she exclaimed, "They have taken her." This definitive statement suggests an immediate conclusion of abduction. Analysts argue that leaping instantly to the conclusion of a third-party removal is unusual in the initial seconds of a disappearance, where confusion usually reigns. To assert that they had taken the subject implies a level of knowledge or a pre-existing fear that contradicts the earlier assertions of a safe, secure holiday environment. This immediate declaration of abduction framed the entire subsequent response. The narrative was set within seconds. It was not a case of a wandering individual or an accident, but a crime committed by an external entity. This framing directed the initial search efforts outward, away from the apartment and into the village, potentially diverting attention from the primary scene. Critics of the initial investigation point out that this assumption prevented the group and early responders from considering alternative scenarios, such as the subject wandering out and meeting with an accident on the complex grounds. The chaos that ensued following the alarm effectively compromised the forensic integrity of apartment 5A. In the panic of the moment, members of the dining group and resort staff rushed into the apartment. This influx of people contaminated the scene, trampling over potential footprints, disturbing DNA evidence, and moving objects. From a police procedural standpoint, the scene was catastrophic. A location that should have been sealed immediately for forensic examination was instead turned into a hub of frantic activity. This degradation of the crime scene would later severely hamper the Portuguese authorities' ability to recover clear forensic data, leading to a reliance on witness testimony that was becoming increasingly fluid. Furthermore, the behavior of the group in the immediate aftermath raised eyebrows among local law enforcement. The swiftness with which the media was contacted and the high-level political channels that were activated stood in stark contrast to the standard procedure for a missing tourist. Within hours, the machinery of public relations appeared to be gearing up, a speed of response that some commentators suggest indicates a focus on narrative control rather than a standard emergency search. The mother's reaction leaving the twins alone to run back to the restaurant remains one of the most contentious aspects of that night. It challenges the protective parent archetype. Critics argue that if one truly believed a predator had just been in the room, one would not leave the remaining family members defenseless to run hundreds of meters away. Defenders of the family argue that panic induces irrational behavior. However, in an investigation where every second and every movement is scrutinized, this deviation from the instinct to protect the remaining offspring serves as a persistent red flag for those who question the official version of events. As the night of May the 3rd bled into the early hours of May the 4th, the narrative of abduction was solidified. The police were searching for a stranger. The media was preparing to broadcast the face of the missing subject to the world, and the discrepancies in the initial reaction were buried under the sheer weight of the unfolding tragedy. The question remained: was the immediate claim of "they have taken her" a mother's intuition? Or was it a defensive construct designed to explain a situation that had spiraled out of control? The answer lay hidden in the silence of apartment 5A, a silence now broken by the noise of a global investigation. As the sun rose over the Algarve on the morning of May the 4th, the sleepy village of Praia da Luz was transformed from a holiday resort into the epicenter of an international crisis. The arrival of the Polícia Judiciária, the Portuguese criminal investigation agency, marked a significant shift in the tone of the events. While the local officers had handled the initial chaotic hours, the Polícia Judiciária brought a level of scrutiny and skepticism that would immediately clash with the narrative being constructed by the group of friends and the visiting British media. From the very outset, the Portuguese investigators were confronted with a crime scene that did not align with the testimony provided. The primary point of friction was the method of entry. The family and their friends maintained that an abduction had taken place, implying that a predator had breached the apartment, removed the sleeping subject, and escaped without detection. However, veteran inspectors noted a distinct lack of forensic evidence to support a forced entry. The shutters of the apartment, a focal point of the early inquiry, showed no signs of being jemmied or forced from the exterior. This physical reality led the Portuguese authorities to an early and controversial hypothesis that the abduction may have been staged to conceal a different sequence of events. This skepticism was standard procedure for the Portuguese police. In cases of missing persons, statistical profiling dictates that the immediate family and those last to see the subject are the first lines of inquiry. As one observer noted, the first place an investigation should look is at the adults who were there or who knew the subject. However, the application of this standard procedure was immediately complicated by the social status of the group. These were not ordinary tourists. They were doctors, surgeons, and medical professional spillers of the British middle class. This status appeared to insulate them from the immediate suspicion that would typically fall upon a working-class family in a similar situation. Simultaneously, a media phenomenon was erupting. Within hours of the disappearance, major British newspapers like the Daily Telegraph were reporting on the case, and the story was featured on breakfast television in the United Kingdom. This speed of information dissemination is highly anomalous. Roughly one person goes missing every 5 minutes in the UK, yet very few garner immediate national headlines. Analysts have questioned why this specific case stood out so starkly. Was it the photogenic nature of the missing subject, or was it the political connections of the father, who had previously undertaken work for the government? The culture clash between the Portuguese legal system and the British media machine became palpable. Portugal operates under the judicial secrecy laws, known as the Segredo de Justiça, which forbids the police from discussing ongoing investigations with the press. In contrast, the British press and the parents themselves demanded constant updates and public appeals. The Portuguese police viewed the parents' immediate engagement with the media as suspicious and counterproductive to a covert investigation. Conversely, the British public viewed the Portuguese police's silence as incompetence. This divergence created a hostile environment where cooperation was strained and nationalistic biases began to color the reporting of the fact. Behind the scenes, the influence of the British establishment began to materialize. It is a matter of record that high-ranking government officials took an unprecedented interest in the case. The Prime Minister at the time, along with his successor, who was due to take office shortly, were involved in communications regarding the situation. This level of diplomatic intervention is extraordinary for a single missing person case. Critics argue that this political pressure may have inhibited the Portuguese police from pursuing their initial theory that the subject had died in the apartment due to an accident and the scene had been manipulated. The Portuguese investigators focused their attention on the timeline discrepancies and the behavior of the group. They found it difficult to reconcile the abduction theory with the logistics of the evening. The idea that a predator had been watching the apartment, knew the precise window of the checking system, and managed to extract a sleeping individual without waking the other two siblings or alerting the parents dining nearby seemed improbable to the seasoned detectives. Furthermore, the immediate assumption by the mother that they have taken her rather than checking for a wandering individual remained a sticking point for the investigators. As the days turned into weeks, the Portuguese police continued to treat the parents and their friends as witnesses, despite their growing suspicions. However, the British investigation, known as Operation Grange, which was established years later, would take a different approach. Explicitly ruling out the parents and friends from the investigation at the start, this decision has been criticized by independent observers as absolutely outrageous, arguing that ruling out the people present at the scene contradicts basic forensic principles. The friction of Chapter 4 is defined by two opposing forces: the forensic reality observed by the Portuguese police, which suggested an internal event, and the public narrative driven by the British media and government, which insisted on an external intruder. The Portuguese police believed the answer lay within apartment 5A, suspecting that the subject had perished inside and was never abducted. The British narrative, however, demanded a global manhunt. This dissonance would only deepen as forensic specialist Sand Their canine counterparts were eventually brought in to bridge the gap between theory and physical evidence. In any major criminal inquiry, the initial statements provided by witnesses serve as the bedrock of the investigation. These early accounts, recorded in the immediate aftermath of an event, are typically viewed by law enforcement as the most raw and unfiltered recollections available. However, as the investigation into the disappearance in Praia da Luz progressed, inspectors from the Policia Judiciaria began to identify a series of troubling discrepancies within the formal statements provided by the group. These inconsistencies, particularly regarding the timeline and the mechanics of entry into apartment 5A, would become the catalyst for the shift in status from witnesses to persons of significant interest. The most glaring anomaly to emerge from the files concerns the testimony of the father. According to the procedural records, the father provided his first official witness statement on May the 4th, the day immediately following the disappearance. In this initial account, he detailed his movements during the checking routine. However, when he was re-interviewed on May the 10th, nearly a week, later crucial details regarding how he accessed the apartment had fundamentally changed. Investigative analysts have focused heavily on this alteration. In the initial version of events, questions were raised about whether the father entered through the front door, which required a key, or the rear patio doors. By the time of the second statement on May the 10th, the narrative had solidified around the use of the rear patio doors, which were reportedly left unlocked to facilitate the dining group's checking system. This shift is significant for forensic reconstruction. If the front door was the primary point of entry in the first version, it implies a secure perimeter. The transition to a narrative involving unlocked patio doors not only admitted to a breach of security, leaving the sleeping family members accessible to the public, but also aligned more convenient logistics for the abductor theory. If the doors were already open, it explained the lack of forced entry, a physical fact that had stumped the Portuguese police from the outset. Why would a witness statement regarding such a basic physical action change within 6 days? Supporters suggest that the trauma of the event caused memory fragmentation. However, skeptical observers and law enforcement professionals argue that the mechanics of opening a door versus walking through an unlocked slider are distinct physical memories. The adjustment of this detail led investigators to speculate whether the narrative was being retroactively fitted to match the physical evidence or lack thereof found at the scene. Since there was no damage to the locks or shutters, the testimony had to evolve to explain how an intruder could enter and exit without leaving a trace. Beyond the method of entry, the checking system itself came under intense scrutiny. The group of friends, often referred to in the media as the Tapas 7, provided statements that aimed to corroborate a tight timeline of surveillance. They claimed that the checking intervals were regular and sufficient. Yet, under cross-referencing, the precision of this timeline began to fray. Some members of the group admitted that their checks did not involve visually confirming the presence of the sleeping subject. Instead, they merely listened at the door or outside the window. This distinction between a visual check and an auditory check is critical. The father claimed to have had a visual confirmation at roughly 9 o'clock. However, other members of the group who checked later could only confirm silence. In a forensic context, silence is not proof of presence. The timeline constructed by the group relied on the assumption that the subject was present and asleep simply because there was no noise. This allowed for a window of opportunity that was far wider than the 20 minutes frequently cited in the press. If the checks were merely auditory, the subject could have been absent from the apartment for a significantly longer duration than admitted. Furthermore, the behavior of the shutter in the bedroom became a point of contention. The mother claimed that upon her discovery at 10 o'clock, the window was open and the shutter was raised, implying the route of the abductor. She suggested that the draft from the open window caused the door to slam, alerting her to the disturbance. However, police tests on the shutters revealed that they could not be opened from the outside without significant force or noise, and they were heavy metal structures that did not simply slide up silently. The lack of forensic damage to these shutters contradicted the forced entry narrative. If the shutters were up, they had to have been raised from the inside, or the abductor had seemingly impossible knowledge of the locking mechanisms. The sheer number of discrepancies began to build a wall of distrust between the group and the local authorities. The Portuguese police, experienced in dealing with inconsistent testimonies, viewed these shifts not as confusion, but as obfuscation. The collective behavior of the group, the changing of entry details, the reliance on listening checks, and the insistence on a timeline that forensic evidence could not fully suggested a coordinated attempt to control the narrative. Analysts have often pointed out that the group consisted of intelligent, high-functioning professionals. In a crisis, such individuals are capable of rapid rationalization. The theory arose that the group, realizing the potential legal and professional consequences of leaving their dependents unattended, might have unconsciously or consciously aligned their stories to minimize the appearance of neglect. The narrative of the checking system had to be robust enough to withstand accusations of abandonment. By the end of the initial interrogation phase, the Portuguese police files were filled with these contradictions. The father's changed statement regarding the entry point stood as a documented anomaly. The impossibility of the shutter being opened from the outside without damage remained a physical fact that testimony could not overwrite. These were not merely gaps in memory. They were structural flaws in the version of events presented to the world. As the investigation moved forward, these inconsistencies would provide the justification for the Portuguese authorities to look inward at the very people who had reported the crime rather than outward at a phantom predator. The groundwork for the arguido status was being laid, brick by contradictory brick. In the absence of immediate forensic breakthroughs or digital footprints, the early stages of the investigation into the disappearance at Praia da Luz relied heavily on the fragile currency of eyewitness testimony. For months, and indeed years, the global public was presented with a singular image of a suspect, a sketch of a man carrying a sleeping individual through the streets of the resort. However, a granular review of the police files reveals a complex tale of two distinct sightings, one which became the cornerstone of the media campaign, and another which was quietly relegated to the background, despite its potentially explosive implications for the timeline and the list of suspects. The first sighting, which dominated the initial narrative, is known in investigative circles as the Tanner sighting. This account was provided by one of the friends dining with the family, who claimed that at approximately 9:15 in the evening, she observed a man walking away from the apartment complex, carrying a small bundle that resembled a sleeping person. For years, this description was circulated globally as the definitive abductor. The timing was convenient for the defense of the parents. It placed the moment of the crime during the window between checks, specifically while the father was absent from the table but reportedly engaged in conversation elsewhere. However, years later, during the British review known as Operation Grange, this sighting was effectively dismissed. Investigators identified the figure not as a predator, but as an innocent British holidaymaker returning his own sleeping family member to their apartment after a night at the creche. This revelation was significant. It meant that the primary lead pursued by private detectives and the media for years had been a red herring, a phantom that distracted from other evidence. With the Tanner sighting neutralized, the focus of independent analysts shifted to the second, far more troubling witness accounton that had been largely absent from the mainstream press coverage. This second account is known as the Smith sighting. This testimony was provided not by a friend of the family, but by an independent Irish family named Smith, who were holidaying in Praia da Luz at the same time. Their statement, which can be found in the archived Portuguese police files, describes an encounter that took place at a much more critical juncture in the timeline. Approximately 10 o'clock in the evening. This timing is pivotal, as it coincides almost exactly with the moment the mother raised the alarm at the tapas bar, claiming the subject had been taken. According to the Smith family's testimony, they were walking back to their accommodation after an evening out when they observed a man walking down the street, heading away from the apartment complex and toward the ocean. They described the man as carrying a small, sleeping individual in his arms. Unlike the Tanner sighting, which described a man hurrying away, the figure in the Smith sighting was described as walking with a casual, purposeful gait, not appearing to be in a panic. The most contentious aspect of the Smith sighting lies in the identification of the man. In their formal statements to the police, the Smith family claimed that they were between 60 and 80% certain that the man they saw carrying the individual was the father of the missing subject. They noted specific details about his appearance and posture that they felt matched the images of the father they later saw in the media. This identification presents a stark contradiction to the official timeline presented by the group of friends. If the Smith sighting was accurate, it placed the father not at the restaurant or searching the apartment, but on the street, carrying the missing subject toward the sea at the very moment the abduction was being discovered. Investigative journalists and commentators have long questioned why this specific sighting received a fraction of the publicity afforded to the now-debunked Tanner sighting. Source documents suggest that this is the stuff you don't see in the press, indicating a potential bias in how evidence was filtered for public consumption. The media narrative focused intensely on the idea of a stranger, a predator lurking in the shadows, while testimony that implicated the parents or their circle was frequently minimized or framed as unreliable. The implications of the Smith sighting are profound for the abduction theory. If the man seen heading toward the beach was indeed the father, it necessitates a complete re-evaluation of the events of that night. It suggests that the movement of the missing subject may not have been the act of a stranger breaking in, but rather an event involving those entrusted with the subject's care. The direction of travel toward the sea also aligns with theories later explored by the Portuguese police regarding the potential concealment of the subject. Furthermore, the dismissal of the Smith sighting by the family's private investigators has drawn criticism. When constructing artist impressions of suspects, the focus remained on descriptions that pointed away from the group. The Smith effort, which bore a resemblance to the father, was not widely circulated by the family's campaign until years later, and even then, it was often presented with caveats. The contrast between the two sightings serves as a case study in confirmation bias. The Tanner sighting supported the theory of an intruder and provided an alibi for the parents. Therefore, it was amplified. The Smith sighting contradicted the intruder theory and placed a member of the inner circle at the center of the disappearance. Therefore, it was treated with extreme caution. As the years have passed, the credibility of the Smith family has remained a thorn in the side of the abduction narrative. They had no connection to the medical group, no motive to fabricate a story, and their account was given to the police shortly after the event, remaining consistent over time. In the final analysis of the eyewitness data, the Smith sighting stands as one of the most significant unresolved anomalies. It is a piece of the puzzle that does not fit into the picture of a random burglary or a predatory strike. Instead, it sketches a disturbing possibility that the figure seen walking into the night was not a stranger fleeing a crime scene, but a familiar face engaged in an act that the world was never meant to witness. The Portuguese police files remain the primary repository for this testimony, a silent testament to a version of events that the public was largely encouraged to ignore. As the summer of 2007 faded, the initial momentum of the physical search began to wane. The vast sweeps of the scrubland and the coastline had yielded no physical trace of the missing subject. Recognizing that witness testimonies were becoming increasingly contradictory, the Portuguese authorities made a strategic decision to shift the focus from a standard missing person inquiry to a forensic cold case review. This pivot brought a new element into the investigation: the introduction of highly specialized canine units, a move that would produce some of the most controversial and scientifically debated evidence in the entire case file. The Policia Judiciaria enlisted the services of Martin Grime, a renowned expert in the field of canine forensics. Grime arrived in the Algarve with 2 English Springer Spaniels, animals that were regarded as being at the top of the range in their respective disciplines. These were not ordinary police dogs trained to track fleeing suspects or sniff out narcotics. They were elite biological detection tools. One was trained as an enhanced victim recovery dog, specifically conditioned to detect the scent of human remains, even if the source was historic or microscopic. The other was a forensic detection dog, trained to alert only to specific human biological markers, ignoring other distractors. The reputation of these animals preceded them. Legal analysts have noted that the work of Martin Grime and his canines has been pivotal in judicial proceedings across the globe, including in the United States. There are documented instances where individuals have been convicted of serious crimes based largely on the testimony provided by these dogs. Even in cases where no physical body was ever recovered, their deployment in Praia da Luz was a clear signal that the investigators were now seriously considering the possibility that the subject had not been abducted alive, but had instead expired within the vicinity. The operation was conducted with rigorous scientific controls. To ensure the validity of any potential alerts, the dogs were not only tasked with searching apartment 5A, they were also deployed to search the apartments of the other members of the dining group, the Friends, who had accompanied the family on the holiday. This created a control environment. If the dogs were alerting falsely or randomly, one would expect to see reactions in multiple locations. However, the results were starkly specific. The dogs did not provide a single alert in the apartments of the Friends. They remained passive in every location except one. It was inside apartment 5A, the site of the reported disappearance, that the dog's behavior changed. According to the police files, the dogs provided strong alerts in specific zones of the living quarters. The forensic canine alerted to a specific area behind the sofa. This alert suggested the presence of forensic evidence, a finding that directly contradicted the narrative of an abduction by a stranger. Simultaneously, the enhanced victim recovery dog, trained to detect specific biological scents, also alerted within the apartment. The implications of these alerts were profound. The Portuguese police interpreted this behavior as an indication that a death may have occurred within the apartment. This hypothesis that the subject died in the apartment and the abduction was a cover-up became the primary working theory for the lead investigators. The physical reaction of the dogs provided the first tangible link between the missing subject and a potential demise within the holiday accommodation, challenging the parents' insistence that their daughter had been taken by a predator. However, the transition from canine intelligence to admissible forensic evidence proved to be complex. While the dogs were precise, the subsequent laboratory analysis faced significant hurdles. Samples of DNA recovered from the areas where the dogs alerted were sent for advanced testing. Reports indicate that there were complications with the forensic science services and issues regarding the quality and quantity of the DNA samples. While the samples showed a high allele count that appeared to be related to the missing subject, the degradation of the material meant that the results were open to interpretation by defense teams. Critically, the investigation also utilized the dogs to examine vehicles. Weeks after the disappearance, the parents had hired a rental car to facilitate their movements. Despite the vehicle being obtained long after the initial event, the dogs reportedly alerted to this car as well. This specific detail, the presence of forensic alerts in a vehicle rented 24 days after the subject went missing, presented a timeline anomaly that independent observers find difficult to dismiss. If the subject had been abducted by a stranger on the night of the 3rd, why would forensic dogs detect her specific biological signature in a vehicle that did not exist in the family's possession at that time? The public reaction to the forensic findings was polarized. The media, largely sympathetic to the parents, often downplayed the significance of the canine alerts, emphasizing that dogs are not evidence. Yet, those familiar with criminal investigation procedures argue that the specificity of the alerts only in the subject's apartment and the family's rental car, and never in the friends' accommodations, cannot be easily explained away as coincidence. The arrival of the forensic specialists marked the moment the investigation ceased to be a search for a missing person and became a homicide inquiry. The dogs had provided a scent trail that led not to the beach or the border, but inward, pointing directly at the narrative constructed by the adults. The Portuguese police were no longer looking for a man carrying a child. They were looking for an explanation as to why these biological traces were present in the place where a holiday was meant to be unfolding. This forensic pivot would set the stage for the intense legal and diplomatic battles that were yet to come. If the alerts within apartment 5A provided the initial spark of suspicion for the Portuguese authorities, the forensic examination of a silver Renault scenic rental vehicle turned that spark into a blazing fire of inquiry. This specific phase of the investigation represents perhaps the most confounding and logically challenging aspect of the entire case. While the examination of the apartment could be debated through the lens of proximity and access, the forensic findings related to this vehicle introduced a temporal paradox that defense teams and independent analysts have struggled to reconcile for nearly 2 decades. The vehicle in question was not present on the night of the disappearance. Official records confirm that the parents hired this car roughly 24 days after the initial report was filed. For the first 3 weeks of the search, the group had relied on other means of transport or remained within the village. Therefore, by all conventional logic, this vehicle should have been entirely sterile regarding forensic evidence linked to the missing subject. If the abduction narrative were accurate that a stranger removed the subject on the night of May the 3rd and vanished, there is no plausible reason for the subject's biological markers to be present in a car that was not obtained until late May. However, the deployment of the highly specialized forensic canines yielded results that directly challenged this logic. According to the investigation files, the enhanced victim recovery dog and the human blood detection dog were tasked with examining the vehicle. In a controlled setting, the dogs reportedly provided specific and strong indications to the interior of the car's boot and to the key fob belonging to the vehicle. These were not hesitant reactions. They were definitive indications that the specific forensic markers the dogs were trained to detect were present in a machine that had only come into the family's possession weeks after the event. The implications of these alerts were immediate and severe. For the Portuguese investigators, this evidence suggested a disturbing evolution of the timeline. It led to the formulation of a hypothesis that the missing subject had not been removed from the area immediately, but rather that the remains may have been concealed and subsequently moved at a later date. This theory posited that the rental vehicle was used to transport the subject from a temporary hiding place to a final location, an act that would necessitate the involvement of those with access to the car. Following the canine alerts, forensic technicians recovered biological samples from the alerted areas. Laboratory analysis of these samples revealed a complex DNA profile. Reports indicated a high allele count that appeared to correlate with the genetic profile of the missing subject. While the science of low copy number DNA is often debated in legal circles due to the risk of contamination, the presence of such specific genetic material in a vehicle rented weeks post-disappearance was a detail that the Policia Judiciaria could not ignore. To explain this anomaly, 2 competing narratives emerged. The defense and supporters of the family argued that the presence of the DNA could be attributed to transfer. They suggested that biological material might have been transferred onto the parents' clothing or personal items, such as the subject's favorite soft toy, which the mother carried constantly and then deposited into the vehicle. This theory relies on the concept of secondary transfer, suggesting that sweat or saliva from the toy could mimic the forensic profile of the subject. However, forensic experts and critical observers have raised significant doubts about this explanation. The specific scent that the enhanced victim recovery dog is trained to detect is a unique biological signature, one that is distinct from the scent of a living person. The dog's alert to the key fob and the boot suggested contact with something far more significant than a mere toy. Furthermore, if the transfer theory were valid, one might expect similar alerts in other vehicles or locations frequented by the parents, yet the alerts were notably specific to this car and the apartment. The analysis of the rental vehicle remains a critical pivot point in the case. It forced the investigation to look beyond the timeline of the first night. If the forensic evidence is accepted as valid, it effectively dismantles the abduction by a stranger theory, as no stranger would have had access to a car hired by the parents 3 weeks later. Conversely, If the evidence is dismissed as contamination, it highlights the immense difficulty of conducting a forensic inquiry in a media-saturated environment where crime scene integrity is compromised. The Portuguese police viewed the rental car evidence as the smoking gun. It was this specific finding that emboldened them to escalate the legal status of the parents. In their view, the car bridged the gap between a missing person case and a potential concealment of a body. The mystery of the Renault Scenic stands as a testament to the enduring complexity of the case. A piece of metal and glass that should have been irrelevant, yet somehow held the ghost of a chemical signature that pointed largely in one direction inward, toward the very people leading the campaign to find the missing subject. By the autumn of 2007, the investigation, led by the Portuguese Polícia Judiciária, had undergone a fundamental transformation. The initial hypothesis of a predatory strike by an unknown intruder, a theory that had captivated the global media, was quietly being dismantled within the walls of the inquiry headquarters. In its place, a far more domestic and tragic working theory emerged, one that sought to explain the forensic anomalies found within apartment 5A without the need for a phantom abductor. This hypothesis, known as the accident theory, remains the most controversial and fiercely debated aspect of the entire case file. The lead investigators, having analyzed the timeline, the lack of forced entry, and the specific alerts provided by the forensic canines, began to construct a sequence of events that centered on a fatal mishap rather than a criminal removal. The Portuguese police postulated that the missing subject had not been taken from the apartment alive, but rather had expired within the premises earlier in the evening. This theory was not based on conjecture alone, but was an attempt to fit the narrative to the physical evidences. Specifically, the blood and cadaver alerts detected behind the sofa in the living area. According to the files archived by the Portuguese authorities, the reconstruction of the event suggested a scenario where the subject woke up during the interval between the parents' checks. Finding themselves alone, and perhaps disoriented, the subject may have attempted to look for the parents. The theory posits that the subject climbed onto the back of the sofa, which was positioned near the window, to look out toward the patio or the street. In this precarious position, it is believed the subject lost their footing and fell, resulting in a tragic accident. This narrative of an accidental passing provided a logical explanation for several troubling inconsistencies. It explained why there was no evidence of a break-in, as the apartment was already accessible. It explained the specific alerts of the forensic dog behind the sofa, a location that would correspond with where the incident allegedly took place. Most critically, it offered a motive for the subsequent behavior of the group, which the police characterized as a staged abduction. The logic of the investigators was that if such an accident had occurred, the parents, both medical professionals, would have faced immediate and catastrophic professional repercussions. A finding of death due to negligence, leaving the family members unattended in an unlocked apartment, could have resulted in the loss of their medical licenses, their careers, and the custody of their remaining offspring. The police theorized that, faced with this sudden and irreversible tragedy, a decision was made in a moment of panic to conceal the reality of the accident and fabricate a scenario that absolved them of neglect, a kidnapping by a stranger. This hypothesis suggests that the window and shutter were manipulated after the fact to create the illusion of an entry and exit point. It recontextualizes the mother's initial declaration that they have taken her as a preemptive framing of the narrative, designed to direct the search away from the apartment and towards an external threat. Under this theory, the frantic search, the immediate media engagement, and the global campaign were not efforts to recover a living person, but a complex mechanism to maintain the cover story. Independent analysts and legal observers have noted the profound psychological weight of this theory. It requires one to believe that respectable, middle-class doctors were capable of concealing a fatal incident involving their own family member to protect their social and professional standing. While this seems unfathomable to the general public, criminologists point out that staging is a known phenomenon in domestic accidents where the responsible parties fear legal culpability. The Portuguese police were less swayed by the social status of the subjects and more focused on the cold logic of the forensic indicators. The accident theory also addresses the timeline discrepancies. If the event occurred earlier in the evening, perhaps before the final check, it would explain why the abductor was never seen by the other independent witnesses in the resort, with the exception of the Smith family sighting, which could be reinterpreted as the movement of the subject to a hiding place. Ultimately, this theory formed the basis of the decision to name the parents as arguidos, or formal suspects. The Portuguese authorities believed they were investigating a case of concealing a body and obstructing justice rather than a kidnapping. However, without a body to prove the cause of death, and with the forensic evidence from the car and apartment being contested as inconclusive or degraded, the theory could not be proven to a criminal standard at that time. When the case was eventually archived, it was not because the parents were exonerated. The Portuguese Supreme Court explicitly stated that the archiving of the case did not equate to a finding of innocence. Rather, it was a procedural pause due to a lack of sufficient evidence to proceed to prosecution. The accident theory remains the official, albeit unproven, conclusion of the initial investigation, a ghost story of a fall, a stone floor, and a panic that spiraled into a global phenomenon. It stands in stark contrast to the abduction narrative, leaving the public to decide which version of events aligns more closely with the evidence of the dogs and the silence of the room. By the middle of May 2007, the investigation into the disappearance in Praia da Luz had transcended the boundaries of a typical police procedural. What began as a local inquiry in a small Portuguese coastal village had rapidly metastasized into a diplomatic affair involving the highest echelons of the British government. This unprecedented political intervention remains one of the most defining and scrutinized aspects of the case, raising uncomfortable questions about privilege, class, and the relationship between the state and the individual. It is a matter of historical record that the reaction from the British establishment was immediate and robust. Within hours of the alarm being raised, mechanisms were activated that are rarely, if ever, deployed for standard missing person cases. Reports indicate that a British minister was involved in the situation almost immediately. This swift mobilization of government resources stands in stark contrast to the statistical reality of missing persons in the United Kingdom, where one individual is reported missing roughly every 5 minutes. In the vast majority of those cases, the families must navigate the bureaucracy alone. In this specific instance, the machinery of the state appeared to gear up instantly to support the subjects. The level of political engagement extended to the very top of the British executive branch. Tony Blair, who was the Prime Minister at the time of the disappearance, became personally involved. It is reported that he had conversations regarding the situation, a gesture of support that is undeniably humane but politically significant. This involvement did not cease with his departure from office. Gordon Brown, who replaced Blair as Prime Minister roughly a month and a half later, continued this high-level focus on the case. Observers and political analysts have long debated the motivation behind this exceptional response. Was it purely a humanitarian reaction to a high-profile tragedy, or were other factors at play? It has been noted in investigative files that the father of the missing subject was not merely a consultant cardiologist but had also performed work for the government. While the extent of these connections remains a topic of speculation, the correlation between the family's professional standing and the government's response is difficult to dismiss. The family belonged to a specific demographic: medical professionals, articulate and well-connected, which arguably facilitated a level of access to power that a working-class family in a similar predicament would likely never receive. The impact of this political pressure on the Portuguese investigation cannot be overstated. The Polícia Judiciária found themselves operating under the intense glare of not just the world's media, but also the British diplomatic corps. Critics argue that this environment may have stifled the independence of the local inquiry. When a foreign government signals such intense interest in a case, it inevitably places pressure on the host nation to produce results that align with the expectations of that foreign power. In this context, The narrative of abduction was the politically palatable option, whereas the theory of a domestic accident involving the parents who were being supported by the Prime Minister was diplomatically sensitive. Furthermore, the government's involvement extended to the management of the media narrative. The swift arrival of government-adjacent media advisors helped to professionalize the family's public relations campaign. This ensured that the story remained on the front pages of newspapers like the Daily Telegraph and on breakfast television screens, keeping the pressure on the Portuguese authorities. This dominance of the information space allowed the family to shape the public perception of the events, often drowning out the more skeptical voices emerging from the Portuguese police force. This sustained political backing also laid the groundwork for the eventual financial commitment of the British state. The establishment of Operation Grange years later, funded by millions of pounds of taxpayer money, can be traced back to this initial period of political buy-in. Some investigative journalists have expressed the view that the continuation of funding from one Home Secretary to the next serves a purpose beyond mere investigation. There is a school of thought suggesting that the indefinite funding helps to maintain a specific status quo, potentially preventing uncomfortable truths from emerging that would embarrass the political figures who aligned themselves so closely with the family from the start. The intersection of politics and policing, in this case, created a unique anomaly. Typically, law enforcement agencies maintain a respectful distance from the subjects of an investigation until all facts are verified. In this instance, the subjects were embraced by the political establishment almost immediately. This signaled to the world and to the investigators in Portugal that these individuals were victims first and foremost, a designation that the Portuguese police were not yet ready to confirm based on the forensic evidence available at the time. As the weeks turned into months, the diplomatic tension simmered. The Portuguese authorities were investigating the parents as potential suspects in a cover-up, while the British government was treating them as ambassadors for a campaign on missing individuals. This dissonance created a chaotic investigative environment. The questions raised by this chapter of the saga are profound. Does the value of a missing subject depend on the social status of their parents? And did the heavy hand of political intervention obscure the path to the truth rather than illuminate it? The enduring mystery suggests that when politics enters the crime scene, justice often struggles to find its way. The investigative landscape shifted dramatically in September of 2007, when the Portuguese legal system formally designated the parents as arguidos, or named suspects. This procedural change was not merely a label. It signified that the Policia Judiciaria had gathered sufficient preliminary data to suspect involvement in the events surrounding the disappearance. This development fundamentally altered the dynamic between the family and the authorities, transforming them from grieving victims into subjects of a criminal inquiry. During this tense period, the mother was subjected to an intense interrogation session. Legal observers have noted that during this questioning, she exercised her right to silence to an extraordinary degree. It is widely reported in legal analyses of the case that she refused to answer 48 specific questions put to her by the investigators, choosing to answer only a single inquiry. While the right to silence is a cornerstone of defense in the court of public opinion, this refusal to engage with the details of the timeline was viewed by skeptics as a defensive maneuver rather than a cooperative effort to find the missing subject. The Portuguese authorities were operating under a specific hypothesis, that the subject had perished within apartment 5A due to an accident, and that the abduction was a fabrication designed to conceal this tragedy. Reports suggest that a plea bargain may have been considered, offering a lenient sentence in exchange for an admission of accidental death and concealment. However, the parents staunchly maintained their innocence, rejecting any narrative that implicated them in the demise of their daughter. Shortly after being named suspects, the family made the decision to return to the United Kingdom. This departure was significant. While legally permissible, it placed a physical and jurisdictional barrier between the subjects of the inquiry and the lead investigators. The Portuguese police were left to continue their work with the primary persons of interest residing in a different country, protected by a different legal system, and supported by a powerful media campaign. The arguido status would hang over the family for months, a legal cloud that was only lifted when the case was eventually archived due to a lack of conclusive evidence, though the Supreme Court later clarified that this did not equate to a finding of innocence. Years after the initial investigation stalled, the British government launched its own dedicated inquiry, known as Operation Grange. This initiative, run by the Metropolitan Police, represents a unique anomaly in the history of British law enforcement. The operation has been funded entirely by the British taxpayer, with costs escalating to an estimated £14 million over the last decade. This massive allocation of resources has drawn sharp criticism from observers who question why this single case merits such indefinite financial support. When roughly one person goes missing every 5 minutes in the UK without receiving comparable attention. A critical analysis of Operation Grange reveals a controversial starting premise. The investigating officer announced at the commencement of the operation that neither the parents nor the group of friends present at the dinner would be considered part of the investigation. Independent investigators and criminologists have labeled this decision as absolutely outrageous. In standard forensic practice, the people last seen with a missing subject are the first to be scrutinized to rule them out conclusively. By exonerating the Tapas 7 from the get-go, Operation Grange effectively ignored the Portuguese police's primary line of inquiry. Critics argue that this operational structure suggests a predetermined outcome. If the people with the most access to the subject are removed from the suspect list before the review begins, the investigation is forced to look exclusively for an external perpetrator. This approach aligns with the abduction narrative, but disregards the alerts provided by the specialist dogs within the apartment and the rental vehicle. The continuation of this funding, authorized by successive prime ministers and home secretaries, has led to speculation about the involvement of the establishment. Observers question whether the investigation is being prolonged to uncover the truth or to prevent the collapse of the official narrative. The sheer scale of the expenditure, millions of pounds for a crime that ostensibly occurred in a foreign jurisdiction, remains a contentious issue for the British public, symbolizing a disparity in how justice is pursued based on the social standing of the individuals involved. The narrative of the disappearance has been heavily shaped not just by evidence, but by litigation. In the years following the event, a robust legal strategy was employed to control the media coverage of the case. This approach effectively silenced many dissenting voices and discouraged journalists from exploring theories that contradicted the abduction hypothesis. A defining moment in this media war was the lawsuit brought against the Daily Express and other publications. Newspapers that had dared to scrutinize the inconsistencies in the parents' testimonies or report on the Portuguese police's suspicions faced severe legal consequences. The Daily Express was forced to publish an unprecedented front-page apology and pay substantial damages. This victory for the family's legal team had a chilling effect on the wider press. Journalists and editors, fearful of financial ruin, ceased to ask difficult questions. The investigative rigor that initially defined the coverage was replaced by a compliant repetition of the family's press releases. Analysts argue that this aggressive use of libel laws created a sanitized version of history. By legally enforcing the abduction narrative, the complexities of the case, such as the Smith sighting or the cadaver dog alerts, were pushed to the margins of public discourse. The threat of litigation meant that valid forensic questions were labeled as smears, and the pursuit of the truth became secondary to the protection of reputations. This legal firewall has made it exceptionally difficult for independent investigators to challenge the official story without facing the threat of a lawsuit, effectively letting the abduction theory stand unchallenged in the mainstream media. In recent years, the narrative took another dramatic turn with the identification of a German national as a prime suspect. This development occurred at a time when funding for Operation Grange was under threat of being cut, leading cynical observers to question the timing of the announcement. The introduction of this new suspect provided a justification for extending the investigation and securing additional taxpayer funds. However, a closer examination of the case against this German individual reveals significant gaps. While the suspect has a documented history of criminal behavior, no physical evidence has been publicly presented that places him inside apartment 5A on the night of May the 3rd. There is no DNA evidence linking him to the room, and the forensic alerts from the specialized dogs, which pointed to the area behind the sofa and the family's rental cardo, not fit the profile of an intruder who entered and left quickly. Critics view this development as a classic example of deflection. By focusing the world's attention on a villainous outsider, the authorities can divert scrutiny away from the unresolved inconsistencies of the original timeline. The German suspect serves as a convenient vessel for the abduction theory, yet his involvement does not explain the specific forensic anomalies detected by the dogs, nor does it account for the changing witness statements of the dining group. Until physical evidence connects this individual to the specific crime scene, he remains, in the eyes of many analysts, a scapegoat used to keep the case open and the funds flowing. As we reach the conclusion of this analysis, the case of the disappearance in Praia da Luz remains a haunting enigma, caught between two irreconcilable truths. On one side stands the official British narrative, a tragic abduction by a stranger, supported by political power and sustained by millions in public funding. On the other side lies the Portuguese police files, a theory of a domestic accident and a subsequent cover-up, supported by the cold, unbribable senses of the forensic dogs. The Portuguese Supreme Court has left the final word ambiguous. While the case was archived, the court explicitly stated that the parents had not been cleared of involvement. This legal limbo mirrors the state of the investigation itself. The abduction has never been proven. No trace of the subject has been found leaving the apartment, and no credible sighting has ever been confirmed. Conversely, the accident theory, while consistent with the dog alerts behind the sofa and in the rental car, lacks the finality of physical recovery. The enduring legacy of this case is not just the loss of a young individual, but the revelation of how justice can be warped by influence. The Tapas 7, the changing statements, the Smith sighting, and the refusal to answer questions. These are the jagged edges of a puzzle that refuses to be smooth. The truth may never be announced at a press conference. Instead, it likely resides in the silence of the archived files, waiting for a time when the noise of politics and media fades enough for the evidence to speak for itself. Until then, the mystery of apartment 5A remains the world's most famous and most disturbing unsolved puzzle. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of the most complex and controversial cases in modern history. We have walked through the timeline, analyzed the forensic anomalies, and questioned the narratives that have been presented to us for nearly 2 decades. This case is more than just a mystery. It is a lesson in how media, politics, and law enforcement intersect. It challenges us to look beyond the headlines and examine the raw details, the witness statements, the dog alerts, and the inconsistencies that refuse to go away. If you found this analysis valuable and want to see more content where we dissect complex cases with logic and facts, please consider engaging with this channel. Your support allows us to keep asking the difficult questions that others might ignore. Stay curious, stay critical, and never stop looking for the truth. I will see you in the next investigation.